The Canon R6 Mark I is one of the most popular cameras from Canon, so I got my hands on one to see what the hype is all about. I immediately realized there's some great things about this camera that you simply don't see on a spec sheet, but there's still a few negatives. So I tested the R6 Mark I out on a variety of shoots to see how it performs for different photographers and video shooters in scenarios built meant for casual users and professionals. And I also have the Canon R6 Mark II, the more expensive and newer counterpart, to see how it compares. By the way, I'll leave links in the description down below for the best pricing on both of these cameras. On the outside, the R6 looks like a pretty typical mirrorless camera, but at a closer look, I absolutely hate the design of this camera, especially as a hybrid shooter. It's not a bad camera by any means, but it does have a few design quirks that Canon has actually already fixed on their newer cameras. If you want to switch between photo and video mode, you actually have to use the mode dial at the top, and the two settings for photo and video are directly opposite to each other on the mode dial, so it takes a while to switch back and forth, whereas the Canon R6 Mark II has a single button to flip between photo and video, which is way quicker. However, the Canon R6 Mark I is much smaller than other cameras in a similar price range. It's about 20 to 25% lighter, and it just feels more nimble and more easy to carry around for everyday shooting. The smaller design will definitely be appreciated by people that are traveling with their camera a lot and need to save space. The R6 also has a great side articulating screen that is also 100% touch sensitive. You can also use it for autofocus by simply tapping something on the back screen and it will immediately snap to focus. The electronic viewfinder is also very solid. It's a sharp image, great refresh rate with very fluid motion. This is definitely something that photographers will appreciate. And it also has the trusted Canon LP6 battery that you see on all of the Pro line of cameras. And it also has a dual SD card slot for serious shooters. Inside the R6 Mark I, you have a 20 megapixel full frame sensor. Now that's a megapixel count that some people feel is too low. And shooting with it, I never really felt like resolution was the issue. Looking at the photos I shot with it, they're not particularly sharp, but it's nothing that can't be fixed by just adding a little bit of sharpness in Lightroom. Comparing the R6 Mark I to the R6 Mark II, which has a 24 megapixel sensor, there is definitely a difference, and the photos from the R6 Mark II are a tiny bit sharper, but it's nothing earth-shattering. And the 20 megapixel sensor from the R6 Mark I also has really good high ISO performance. You can get great results shooting at ISOs as high as 6400 and even 12,800. You're not going to get a terrible amount of noise. It's very usable. So the 20 megapixel full frame sensor is definitely not the issue here. One of my really close friends, Albert, actually uses the R6 I exclusively, and when you look at his photos, you definitely don't think, gee, I wish this had more resolution or more sharpness. You really think about the artistic vision from his photos. But if you find that you do the kind of photography where you need to go in and touch up very fine detail in your images, I actually wouldn't recommend the R6 Mark I. In fact, you should probably look at something with a higher resolution sensor, like a 33 megapixel sensor on the Sony a7 IV, or something like the 45 megapixel sensor on the Canon R5, but the R5 is actually double in price. One place where the R6 Mark I has a serious advantage compared to other Canon cameras or other cameras from competing brands is photos. The R6 Mark I shoots 12 frames per second in mechanical shutter mode and 20 frames per second electronic shutter mode. All of this in 14-bit RAW. This is super fast for a full frame camera, considering most cameras in the industry right now top out at about 10 frames per second, and the R6 actually shoots just as fast as a $4,000 Canon R5. And it actually gets even better. The R6 Mark I can actually shoot more photos in a row than the more expensive Canon R6 Mark II, which only does about half of that. Also, I'm going to be doing a very detailed comparison video between the R6 Mark I and the R6 Mark II on the channel, so if you want to see that, make sure to subscribe. Let's talk about editing the photos from the R6 Mark I. When it comes to editing the photos from the R6 Mark I, dear God, the Canon colors just look so good. It's such a good starting point for all of your edits, and for me personally, I just find the creative flow is much better when you have such a good place to start from in your colors. And because it's 14-bit RAW, there's a ton of room for flexibility in your light values and color values, and you really need to push these photos pretty far before you see any kind of quality drop-off. The R6 Mark I has pretty great autofocus for photos. It does a really good job with face and eye tracking, and for the most part, everything works really well. But it does sometimes randomly stop working or fall off. However, I find that in photo mode, you don't notice it as much, and for the most part, all of your shots will be in focus. In video mode, however, it's a different story. Video is present in the R6 Mark I, but when this camera was made, as a brand, Canon was still figuring video out, and it has its quirks, and most of those quirks did get fixed in the R6 Mark II, which I also have and I'll talk about. The main video mode you're going to be using is 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second. In this mode, the 4K is actually downsampled from the full 20 megapixel 6K image area, so essentially your 4K video is going to have the detail and clarity of 6K. You can also shoot HDR PQ or C-Log to get more dynamic range and 10-bit color in video. And overall, I was really impressed by how saturated and natural the Canon colors look, even in video mode, and C-Log gives you a lot of flexibility over the colors in your video. I shot a really quick fashion thing with the R6 Mark I, and the quality is definitely good enough for social media, which is where I'm going to put this video. And for the most part, if I had a small budget project, I would definitely use the R6 Mark I, or if I was someone that was just starting off in shooting video. And if you're a casual shooter that's just shooting for yourself, capturing your vacation, your family moments, or just posting on your Instagram, you're going to get really good results in terms of video, and your stuff is going to look way more cinematic than your cell phone. And the R6 Mark I also has built-in stabilization that is directly on the sensor with digital stabilization on top of that, and I was able to get pretty stable video, although not perfect, but this is pretty good considering my lens also did not have stabilization. And in video mode, I was shooting at ISOs as high as 3200, 12800, and I got really good results. Noise at high ISO is definitely not an issue. When it comes to slow motion, this is a feature that professionals definitely need in their camera. And if you're a casual shooter, let's be honest, slow motion makes everything look epic. In slow motion, the R6 can shoot 4K video up to 60 frames per second, but with a 1.6 times crop, which zooms into your image and doesn't give you a full frame look. You get more so the look from like an APS-C camera or a Super 35. This mode is also not downsampled from 6K either, so you just get native 4K quality. This is one of the quirks that I mentioned earlier that Canon was still figuring out with video when they first made this camera, and in the R6 Mark II, it actually has 4K up to 60 frames per second with no crop, and it's also downsampled from 6K. And you also have full HD video up to 120 frames per second for ultra smooth 5x slow motion, but the R6 Mark II can do full HD at 120 and 180 frames per second. The one thing that constantly disappointed me with the R6 Mark I when it comes to video is the autofocus. It does a pretty good job with face and eye tracking and subject detection as a whole, but it would randomly just lose focus. It would snap back to focus immediately. When in video mode, you really notice those mistakes. But I don't mean to make this sound like some massive issue. I've talked to other shooters with a Canon R6 or a Canon R5, and everyone says they have similar autofocusing issues, but no one's switching systems over it, and most of them are photographers. But if you took the time to watch this video, I feel like I owe you guys as much information as possible, so I wanted to mention this. Overall, do I recommend the Canon R6 Mark I? As a video shooter, probably not. The R6 Mark II has better autofocus, 4K 60 without a crop, 6K downsample. This is just made for video. When it comes to the R6 Mark I, it's a phenomenal photo camera, however. The 20 megapixel resolution is absolutely enough as long as you're not doing some kind of super fine detail editing with your photos. The R6 is a beautiful camera for making creative work, and it's also a phenomenal camera for sports and wildlife photography or anything where you need a large frame buffer and you to shoot for a long time. And the Canon R6 Mark I is also about $500 cheaper than not only the newer Canon R6 Mark II, but most of the cameras with similar specs in the market right now. So if you want a good deal on your camera, the Mark I comes at a really great price. And if you want to make sure you get the best price possible on your camera gear, make sure to check out the links in the description down below, and I will see you guys in the next video.